Hi, I'm Jim Smith. This is the 1000. We're dropping back into a sequence of historical episodes right now. The hardest one I think I'm going to have to do in the whole 50 years is the FLQ Crisis. And I'm using this book, English's book, Trudeau. This goes from 68 to 2000, so it covers the area of the FLQ crisis. I'm using this mainly for chronology, not for interpretation, because the interpretation I'm going to give you is pretty much strictly mine. And the FLQ crisis is so hard to explain because it's part of a culture and a time that has so passed into history that the young crowd that I'm aiming this for has no idea what I'm talking about. But if you go back to 1959, 1960, you've got Che Guevara, you've got Fidel Castro knocking out the Batista dictatorship. And Batista was not a nice person by any stretch of the imagination, and almost any thoughtful person would have supported them at that point. They weren't considered as communist stooges or anything else. We had Mao Zedong in China, who had at that point not quite gone off the deep end with the Cultural Revolution and things like that. So it was a time of great upset and turmoil politically. The status quo that General Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, warned about the military-industrial complex, that warning had been seriously taken into heart by the younger generation in the universities, and there was all sorts of turmoil and attacking authority and things like that. And in Quebec, a group of people, the Front de Liberation de Quebec, the FLQ, were trying to separate Quebec from Canada by main force, by violence. And they were blowing up mailboxes, and they were robbing gun shops and banks and stuff like that. And they were basically killing people, and there was a lot of disorder going on. And then they upped it a bit. They kidnapped two people, Pierre Laporte, who was a cabinet minister, and James Cross, who was a mid-level British bureaucrat, diplomat, I guess you could call him, and held them hostage to get their demand that their manifesto be broadcast and various other things. And Mr. Trudeau at that point had come out of his Justice Department position where he had rewritten the criminal code. We talked about that previously, and had moved into heavy-duty politics, becoming the leader of the Liberal Party and the Prime Minister of Canada. And this was his first test, and he was pretty green to the job at this point, although he'd been a bureaucrat for quite some time. And he basically crushed the FLQ. The FLQ are not the innocent bystanders in this thing, because they had killed Mr. Laporte. They were murderers. In my opinion, in those days, there was still capital punishment. They probably should have gone to the end of a rope, which didn't happen to them. But Pierre Trudeau invoked the War Measures Act. We find out from Mr. English in this book that prior to the invocation of the War Measures Act, the RCMP had been ordered to find kindred and like-minded organizations throughout Canada that were revolutionary or government overthrow type people. And out of that, I believe, comes the genesis of the Western Liberation Front myth, which we'll come back to time and time again until you're genuinely sick of this thing. But what Trudeau did is he invoked the War Measures Act. War Measures Act at that time in Canada was the Riot Act. It gave martial law, put troops on the streets of Quebec, and started arresting people. They arrested well over 200 people, and these were basically left-wing academics, intellectuals, union leaders. Not my friends, but they weren't guilty of any crime that has ever been determined afterwards. And believe me, the government looked hard and high and low to try to find that. It was very shocking as a university student sitting in an apartment in beautiful downtown Edmonton going to U of A to have this happening in my country. I didn't know what was going on. It looked like, if you studied it, a coup. It looked like the beginnings of a military coup, and it might have happened that way, except for a very unusual hero, and that is Tommy Douglas, the leader of the then new Democratic Party, which had formed from the CCF, Socialist Agrarian Party in Saskatchewan. And Douglas wouldn't go along with it and stopped it pretty well dead. And it's interesting, just as a side note, the RCMP has records on Tommy Douglas long after the man's dead. He's been dead for years now, that they won't release. And out here in Saskatchewan, where I live, this is kind of a cause célèbre even amongst people who are not socialists by any stretch, is if the RCMP had a reason to be surveilling Mr. Douglas, I'd like to know. And if they didn't, I'd kind of like to know that too, because I kind of go with the latter, actually. The man was a Baptist minister. My dad knew him. He was a pretty straight guy. Don't particularly like his politics, but I think he was an honest man. And I just can't see him as any kind of subversive. This is really important because you and I are considered by many of the bureaucrats in Ottawa and many of the high-ranking police as subversives, that we are somehow anti-government because of our single-issue wish to own firearms. So I'm going to leave it at that now. I'll come back in another episode and explore this in more detail. That's our episode for today. If you liked it, please like it and spread it around that way. Share it with all your friends. And you know, if you can help us out a little bit by supporting us, we'd really appreciate it. This is not a high budget project, but your support really keeps us going. Thanks.